On a gray morning when rain tapped softly against the windows, a woman stepped into a gray house that had forgotten what joy sounded like. Her name was Isabella Hayes, a woman who carried scars too deep for most to see, yet strong enough to keep her standing when life had tried to break her. She had come not for herself, but to care for two children who had known more grief than comfort, Sophia and Daniel Whitmore. Their laughter had been buried beneath silence, their innocence clouded by the heavy shadow of loss. The children's father, Alexander Whitmore, was a man marked by sorrow. Once vibrant, his world had collapsed the day he lost his wife, leaving him a prisoner inside his own grief. Though he was not cruel, his presence carried the weight of storms untold, his silence sharp, his gaze distant, his heart guarded by walls no one dared to cross. He moved through the forsaken, grand home like a ghost bound by duty, not life, leaving the halls cold and empty. For Isabella, the moment she entered those doors, she sensed the fragile balance inside. The air was heavy, the rooms immaculate but lifeless, as if every sound had been stifled before it could take form. Sophia, the elder child, kept her distance with a quietness that felt far older than her years. Daniel, younger but no less wounded, clung to silence as though it were his only shield. Their eyes held unspoken questions. One's Isabella was not sure she could answer, but she knew she had to try. What began as a simple employment contract was already shaping into something far more delicate. Isabella understood that her role was not just to feed and clothe, but to bring warmth back into a place where warmth had been exiled. And though Alexander had hired her merely as a caretaker, a part of her sensed that her presence would test every wall he had built around his heart. The question that lingered was whether she could stitch together the frayed edges of this broken family, or whether the house itself would swallow her spirit whole. The Whitmore household had never been a place of laughter since tragedy struck. Every step Isabella Hayes took during her first days felt like she was walking across fragile glass. The children, Sophia and Daniel, moved like shadows in their own home. They obeyed without a question, kept their distance, and disappeared into corners as if the air itself reminded them not to disturb the silence. Isabella quickly learned that asking them to participate in anything only made them retreat further into themselves. What they needed wasn't commands or direct invitations, but something softer, something that would allow them to come forward on their own terms. One dreary afternoon, when the clouds hung low and the rain whispered against the watermold window panes, Isabella decided it was time to change the rhythm. She tied her hair back, rolled up her sleeves, and set out ingredients on the kitchen counter. Flour, sugar, eggs, cocoa, and butter. Each sound, the crack of an egg, the scrape of a whisk, the soft thud of flour against the bowl was deliberate. She wasn't cooking simply for the sake of baking. This was a performance of sorts, a gentle invitation without words. She left the cupboard doors slightly open, the clinking of utensils drifting through the quiet air. Out of the corner of her eye, Isabella noticed a sliver of movement. Sophia's dark hair appeared at the doorway. Moments later, Daniel's smaller frame followed, his wide eyes cautiously fixed on the counter. Neither child spoke, and Isabella did not acknowledge them at first. She simply cracked an egg into the bowl with one hand, humming softly as though the eating room were not empty at all. "You know," she said, her tone casual, "when I was your age, the best part of baking wasn't the cake itself, it was licking the spoon." She gave a light laugh, as if confiding a secret. "My grandmother always said I only learned to bake for that reason." Daniel's eyes flickered toward the bright paper cupcake liners stacked on the counter. Isabella, pretending not to notice, slid them closer to the edge. "Would you two mind passing me those?" she asked lightly. The hesitation was almost tangible. Then Daniel stepped forward, almost reluctantly, picked up the liners, and placed them on the counter. He didn't meet her gaze, but Isabella rewarded the gesture with a warm smile. "Perfect," she said, as if he had just done something remarkable. "We're making chocolate and vanilla swirls. Ever tried that before?" Sophia shook her head, just barely, but Isabella caught it and responded as though it had been the most enthusiastic answer in the world. "Then today's the day." She sifted the flour, then turned, offering the metal sifter to Sophia. "Want to try?" The girl hesitated, her hands hovering, then finally reached for it. Isabella guided her for only a second before stepping back, letting Sophia press the handle. Soft white flour cascaded into the bowl like snow. For the first time since Isabella's arrival, Sophia's lips pressed into a small, fleeting smile. Daniel leaned forward, his curiosity breaking through his usual guarded expression. Isabella kept her voice steady, neither too loud nor too instructive. "Flour, sugar, cocoa, all the good things," she said warmly. "This is how magic begins." But magic, as it turned out, had a mischievous streak. When Isabella handed Sophia another bag of flour, the seam split unexpectedly, sending a puff of white dust into the air. The powder burst upward, coating Sophia's hair, her clothes, and even her small cheeks. She froze. Instantly, her body stiff with dread, as though she were bracing for punishment. But instead of scolding, Isabella broke into laughter, full, unrestrained, and bright. She leaned against the counter, clutching her side, the joy spilling out of her in waves. "Oh, sweetheart," she managed between breaths, "you look like a snow angel." Sophia blinked, stunned, then slowly, tentatively, the corners of her mouth lifted. The smile grew, shy but genuine, and soon she was giggling. The sound was fragile yet powerful, as if the house itself had been waiting to hear it. Daniel, startled at first, couldn't hold back his grin. He pointed at his sister, his laughter bubbling up in disbelief. "You got flour everywhere, Mom," he said suddenly, the words slipping out before he realized it. His voice carried no hesitation, no barrier, just the natural slip of a child forgetting his guard. The moment hung in the air, suspended in time. Isabella's chest tightened, but she did not correct him. She didn't want to break the spell. Instead, she smiled softly, letting the word linger, knowing it meant far more than a mistake. Daniel had let his guard down. He had called her something that belonged to comfort, to warmth, to love. The sound of footsteps drew Isabella's attention. At the doorway stood Alexander Whitmore, his tall frame leaning heavily against the frame. His expression was caught between confusion and awe, his eyes moving from Isabella to Sophia, then to Daniel, as though he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. For months, his children had been silent shadows. Yet now, Sophia's face was lit with laughter, her eyes bright, her shoulders free of the weight she normally carried. Daniel leaned against the counter beside Isabella, still smiling, still chuckling at his sister. Alexander's jaw tightened, not with anger, but with the sheer force of holding back a rush of emotion. His shoulders, usually stiff and squared, lowered just slightly, his guarded composure slipping. He didn't speak. He didn't dare disturb what was unfolding before him. Isabella, aware of his presence, kept moving naturally, scooping a spoonful of batter and offering it to Sophia, who took it eagerly. Daniel leaned in to scrape the mixing bowl, his shoulder brushing against hers without hesitation. For the first time since their mother's death, the Whitmore kitchen was alive, not with routine, not with silence, but with laughter, warmth, and something resembling family. The scent of cocoa and vanilla filled the air, but it was more than the cupcakes that made the space feel different. It was the way Sophia giggled as a drip of batter fell onto the counter. The way Daniel smirked, wiping it away with his finger. The way Isabella smiled quietly at them, not as an outsider doing her job, but as someone who belonged in that moment. Alexander's eyes softened, his lips pressing into a line that trembled with restraint. He looked at Isabella for a brief second, just long enough for something unspoken to pass between them. She had managed in 2 weeks what he could not accomplish in months, coaxing life, trust, and joy back into his children. And though he did not say it aloud, though his voice remained silent in the heavy doorway, Alexander knew he had just witnessed the first fragile thread of healing being stitched into the fabric of his broken home. The days after the flour mishap seemed to shift the air inside the Whitmore household. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden bursts of conversation or hugs. But something softer, quieter, almost imperceptible. For the first time, Sophia and Daniel no longer vanished the moment Isabella Hayes entered a room. Instead, they lingered, as though testing whether the warmth they had felt that afternoon in the kitchen had been real or just a fleeting accident. Daniel would pause in the doorway while Isabella prepared breakfast, his fingers brushing the pranced frame as if anchoring himself to the moment. Sophia often hovered near the pantry shelves. When Isabella unpacked groceries, her eyes flicking toward the cupcake tin left on the counter. They didn't speak much, but their presence carried a new kind of silence. No longer the Taylor's impenetrable quiet of grief, but a cautious curiosity. Isabella sensed the shift, fragile as it was, and vowed not to push too hard. Trust, she knew, could not be forced. It had to grow. One chilly afternoon, she noticed Daniel searching the kitchen, his brow furrowed. Without Asking what he needed, Isabella placed his favorite pair of dinosaur-patterned socks. Fresh from the laundry on the table. His head shot up, surprise flickering across his face, but when she handed them to him, she added lightly, "Would you like some hot chocolate?" For a moment, he hesitated, then gave a single small nod. Minutes later, the kitchen filled with the rich scent of cocoa. Sophia appeared soon after, drawn by the warmth, though she pretended she had only come for an apple. Isabella didn't comment on the coincidence. Instead, she poured a second cup and slid it toward her. The three of them sat together, sipping quietly. It lasted only a few minutes, but Isabella recognized the importance. It was another stitch in the torn fabric she was mending. The real turning point came in the garden. From the housekeeper, Isabella had learned that the glass house and winter garden had once been Claire Whitmore's sanctuary. It had been months since anyone tended it. When Isabella wandered there one morning, she found Sophia standing silently by the glass doors, her small frame silhouetted against the pale light, staring at the neglected plants. Isabella didn't intrude with words. Instead, she fetched a watering can and quietly began to tend the brittle stems. Sophia watched from behind the glass at first, suspicion and longing warring on her face. But the following days, Isabella returned each morning, leaving the door slightly ajar as if to say, "You're welcome, if you wish." She clipped dead leaves, loosened soil, whispered encouragement to plants that looked nearly beyond saving. On the fourth day, Sophia's soft footsteps crunched on the gravel. She appeared at Isabella's side, her eyes fixed on a bare patch of earth. "That's where the roses used to grow," she murmured, her voice almost lost to the chill air. "Roses?" Isabella repeated gently, as if handling a secret. "Pink ones," Sophia nodded. "Even when it was cold, they still bloomed. They were Mom's roses." Isabella didn't say she was sorry. She didn't offer empty comfort. Instead, she replied, "Then, perhaps we can bring them back." For the first time, Sophia looked at her directly. In her eyes, Isabella glimpsed the flicker of hope, a fragile spark, too rare to ignore. From then on, Sophia lingered longer. At first she simply pointed out where lavender once stood, where tulips had lined the stones, where mint for tea had grown. Isabella listened, never pressing for more. When she finally offered Sophia a hand trowel, the girl hesitated, glanced toward the house as though afraid to be caught, then accepted it. They worked side by side in silence, but it was a silence transformed, no longer a wall, but a rhythm, an exchange of trust. Soon after, Daniel's curiosity drew him in as well. One afternoon, he appeared at the garden door, sketchbook in hand. He didn't offer to help with the plants. Instead, he settled on the plant's gravel path and began to draw. Isabella caught glimpses of his pages, rough outlines of vines creeping along a trellis, sketches of Sophia kneeling in the dirt, even the watering can in Isabella's hands. His drawings were quiet testimonies, capturing the life slowly returning to both the garden and the family. As the days passed, laughter began to reappear in the smallest of places. Sophia giggled when mud streaked her cheek, and Daniel teased her for looking like a warrior. Isabella, instead of correcting them, leaned into the joy, letting it bloom naturally. Sometimes she explained the resilience of roots that survived under frozen soil. Sometimes she simply knelt with them, her hands in the dirt, sharing the small victories of sprouting leaves. It was during one of these afternoons that Alexander Whitmore paused at the edge of the used-out garden. His eyes scanned the scene before him, Sophia brushing soil from her hands, her cheeks flushed with life. Daniel bent over his sketchbook, tongue pressed to his lip in concentration. Isabella kneeling among the flowers, her face bright with quiet satisfaction. For a long moment, he simply stood there, the weight of grief and guilt pressing against his chest. He had not been able to reach them, yet here they were smiling, opening, blooming. He did not step closer, nor speak, but Isabella noticed him. Their eyes met briefly, and in his gaze she saw astonishment, almost reverence. She turned back to the children, without a word, letting the moment stand on its own. Alexander stayed longer than he intended, watching life take root again, before retreating quietly into the house. That evening, as Isabella tidied the playroom, a folded piece of paper slipped from one of the girlian's Daniel's sketchbooks. She opened it hesitantly and found a drawing that stole her breath. 4 figures stood hand in hand, Sophia, Daniel, Isabella, and above them, faint but smiling, Claire. Across the page, in uneven, earnest letters, were the words, "We're okay now." Isabella sat still, her throat tight, understanding the weight of the image. It was not hers to keep, so she placed it gently on Alexander's desk later that night. He unfolded it slowly, his breath catching as his eyes traced the figures. For a long moment, he said nothing. Only when Isabella softly added, "Daniel drew it," did he nod, blinking quickly as he set the picture down, with deliberate care. Later, she saw him place it on the mantel, framed not in glass, but in intention visible to anyone who entered the room. From then on, the drawing became a quiet center of the household. Sophia and Daniel glanced at it when they passed, their eyes softening. Alexander, too, looked at it often, though he never spoke of it. For Isabella, it was proof that the threads she had been weaving were holding, that laughter, trust, and love, though fragile, were mending what loss had torn apart. The storm arrived without warning. One moment, the Whitmore estate sat beneath a sky heavy, but calm, the next a crack of lightning split the air, flooding the windows with white light. Thunder rolled so close behind it that the glass panes rattled in their frames. The house seemed to inhale sharply, its silence disturbed by the violence outside. Isabella was stacking dishes in the cupboard when she heard soft footsteps. Turning, she found Daniel standing in the doorway, his face pale, his small shoulders hunched as though bracing for a blow. His hands clutched the edges of his sweatshirt, knuckles white. Behind him lingered Sophia, her eyes locked on the flashes beyond the glass. Neither child spoke, but Isabella didn't need words. She remembered the housekeeper once mentioning the storm that had taken Claire's life. The night their mother died had been filled with thunder like this. She crossed the room slowly, lowering herself to Daniel's height. "We can't stop the storm," she said softly. "But maybe we can change how it feels." His eyes searched hers, uncertain, but he didn't pull away when she reached for his trembling hand. When the lights flickered, then vanished altogether, Isabella moved quickly. She guided the children into the living room, where she had noticed a basket of mismatched glass jars. Weeks earlier, she placed small candles inside, striking a match to each one until warm, flickering flames shimmered through the glass. The room glowed as if filled with captured fireflies. "These," she whispered, arranging the jars in a loose circle, "are jars of stars. When the sky is too noisy, we borrow its light for ourselves." Daniel's breathing slowed as he stared at the flames, their glow steady against the storm's fury. Sophia traced the rim of a jar with her fingertip. "They look like fireflies," she murmured, almost smiling. Isabella nodded. "Exactly. Little lights that don't mind the rain." They sat together within the circle. When the thunder boomed again, Isabella began to hum a tune from her childhood. A lullaby her grandmother used to sing when storms swept through the south. Slowly, she added words about boats finding harbor, winds that never stayed forever, and lights guiding travelers home. Sophia leaned against her side, while Daniel clutched a small jar Isabella had given him. "This one's the captain's light," she told him. "As long as you hold it, you're safe." The storm still raged outside, but inside their circle, warmth grew. And it was in that moment that the front door opened. Alexander Whitmore stepped inside, dripping from the downpour, his hair plastered to his forehead. Expecting fear and chaos, he froze instead at the sight before him. His children nestled close to Isabella, the room aglow with flickering stars, their faces calm, their breathing steady. What's going on here?" His voice was low, almost afraid to break the fragile magic. Isabella looked up, offering only a gentle smile. "We're just waiting out the storm." Sophia raised her head and added, "We have stars now, they make it better." Daniel didn't speak, but he tightened his grip on the jar as if proving her point. Something in Alexander's face shifted. The hardness, the exhaustion, it eased, replaced by something softer, something long buried. Without hesitation, he lowered himself awkwardly to the carpet, joining their circle. No one announced it, but space widened to include him. Isabella's humming continued, steady and unbroken, weaving him into the calm. For the first time since Claire's death, Alexander simply sat with them, letting warmth replace silence. It was not grand, not dramatic, but the quietest of turning points. In the days that followed, the storm became a memory. Yet its aftermath lingered, carrying with it a new tension. For though Isabella had soothed the children, Alexander could not ignore the way his gaze kept drifting toward her. The lines between employer and something more were blurring. One afternoon, laughter spilled from the garden. The children had convinced Isabella to join them in a game of chase. She ran barefoot through the grass, her hair loose, her smile unguarded. Alexander, leaning on the porch, was pulled in almost against his will. Before long, he joined the chase, his stride catching up with hers. Their laughter collided as he caught her around the waist. They tumbled onto the grass, tangled for a breathless moment. For a heartbeat, Isabella felt the thud of his chest against her arm, the warmth of his hand. Steady at her waist, his face so near she could see the flecks of green in his eyes. The world narrowed, and her lips brushed his soft, tentative, but undeniable. The sound of Sophia calling for her brother shattered the moment. Alexander pulled back. Quickly, his expression tight. "That shouldn't have happened," he said, his voice clipped. "Your place is with them. Professional." Isabella swallowed hard, nodding, though her heart ached at the rejection. She returned to the children, her laughter forced, while Alexander retreated, shutting himself behind the walls he knew too well. Tension thickened later that week. Bedtime became the battleground. Isabella, sensing the children's unease, insisted they needed comfort and reassurance, not strict adherence to the clock. Alexander countered that structure brought stability. Their voices, though controlled, carried enough edge for Sophia to notice. Her eyes darkened, and she slipped away unnoticed. When Isabella realized she was gone, panic clawed at her chest. Searching room to room, she finally thought of the abandoned glass house at the far edge of the estate. Racing through the Place Ferry 5. Drizzle, flashlight in hand, she pushed open the creaking door. There, curled in the corner, was Sophia, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her knees drawn to her chest. "I thought you'd leave," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Mommy and Daddy used to fight before she went away. And then she left." Isabella's heart broke. She knelt, brushing damp hair from Sophia's face. "Sweetheart, look at me. I'm not going anywhere. Adults disagree sometimes, but that doesn't mean someone leaves. I care about you and your brother. I will stay." Sophia's small body trembled, then softened into Isabella's arms. She clung tightly, as though afraid Isabella might disappear if she let go. Isabella wrapped her coat around the girl, guiding her back through the night. At the porch, Alexander stood waiting, worry etched deep on his face. His eyes swept over Sophia, relief flooding him before flicking to Isabella. He didn't speak much, only a strained "thank you," but his gaze carried what words could not, an acknowledgement of how close he had come to losing his daughter again, and of the woman who had brought her safely back. That night, as Sophia drifted into sleep, still holding Isabella's hand until the very last moment, the house seemed to exhale. For all the storms outside, and within something fragile yet unbreakable was beginning to take root, the knowledge that love, comfort, and presence could heal even the deepest fears. The house was still when Isabella Hayes rose before dawn. The wooden floors creaked softly beneath her feet, the air heavy with the hush that only came in the hours before morning. She had barely slept. For days, her thoughts had been restless, looping through the same doubts, until her chest ached with them. She had promised Sophia she would stay. She had whispered reassurances to Daniel when the storm threatened to drown him in memories. Yet with every tender moment, she felt the tension building between herself and Alexander Whitmore. Invisible tug-of-war over what was best for the children. More than once, she caught him watching her, his eyes unreadable, as though he was measuring her presence against something he couldn't name. And in quiet moments, when she found herself replaying the brush of his lips during that stolen second in the garden, she feared she had already crossed lines that could not be undone. The children were opening, blooming, even, but what if her very existence was fracturing their foundation? What if her warmth, instead of healing, was only creating fault lines deeper than before? By the time the clock struck 4, Isabella had made her decision. She could not risk it not. The children's fragile trust, not Alexander's guarded balance. If leaving meant sparing them further conflict, then it was the only path she could take. She dressed quietly, her hands trembling as she packed the few belongings she had brought into the Whitmore home. A worn sweater, a small stack of books, and the framed photo of her parents. On the kitchen counter, she placed 2 envelopes. One bore Alexander's name in her neat handwriting, the other simply read, "For Sophia and Daniel." In Alexander's letter, she thanked him for entrusting her with his children and apologized for the friction her presence had caused. In the children's, she promised that they had been the brightest part of her days, and urged them to keep finding joy, even if it wasn't with her at their side. The rain had already begun by the time she stepped outside, a steady drizzle that seeped into her coat. The estate grounds stretched before her, damp and silent. The iron gate looming in the distance. Each step toward it felt like walking through water, every footfall heavier than the last. By the time she reached the gate, her boots were soaked through, and her breath came in ragged bursts. Her fingers fumbled with the cold iron key. For a moment, she rested her forehead against the forehead against the forehead against the forehead bars, whispering a silent goodbye. She told herself it was better this way, that leaving quietly would hurt less than staying until the fracture split open completely. But then, through the hiss of the rain, she heard it. The crunch of gravel, urgent and uneven. She turned, and her breath caught. Running toward her through the downpour were Alexander and the children. Sophia's hair clung wetly to her face, Daniel's small legs pumping furiously beside her. And Alexander, tall and relentless, matched their pace, his eyes locked onto Isabella, as though sheer will alone could stop her from leaving. Isabella! Sophia's voice broke the storm, high and desperate. In her hands, she clutched a piece of flattened cardboard, its edges frayed and letters scrawled in thick black marker. The words, uneven but powerful, shouted their message even through the rain, "Please stay." The sight pierced Isabella's chest. The sign shook in Sophia's small hands, blurred by rain but unyielding in its plea. Daniel reached her first, breathless, his voice breaking. "We woke up and saw your letters. We ran. We didn't want you to go." His eyes brimmed with tears, his small body trembling as though the thought of her absence had already hollowed him. Isabella dropped the key. It clattered against the gate, forgotten. She fell to her knees in the waning mud, as Sophia crashed into her, cardboard pressed against her chest. "Don't go," the girl whispered. Her words muffled against Isabella's coat. Daniel threw his arms around her from the other side, his hug fierce for someone so small. Isabella held them both tightly, her tears mingling with the rain. When she finally looked up, Alexander stood just a few feet away. His hair dripped into his eyes, his coat heavy with water, but his expression was raw, stripped of the armor he always wore. His voice, when it came, was low but steady, carrying more weight than any storm around them. "We don't need perfect," he said, each word deliberate, unwavering. His gaze held hers, unflinching. "We need you." The words broke something inside her, dissolving the walls she had built around her own heart. Every reason she had constructed for leaving crumbled against the sincerity in his eyes, and the desperate grip of the children in her arms. She opened her mouth to answer, but her throat tightened too much to speak. Instead, she clung tighter, burying her face in Sophia's wet hair, her free hand stroking Daniel's back as he sobbed quietly into her shoulder. The rain kept falling, but it no longer felt cold. It felt cleansing, as though the storm itself was washing away the last of their doubts. Slowly, Alexander stepped closer. His hand hovered for a moment, then rested gently on Sophia's back, then Daniel's. Finally, his eyes found Isabella's again. No barriers, no distance. Only a shared understanding that whatever fragile thing they had built had already become something unbreakable. With trembling hands, Isabella slipped the key back into her pocket. "I'm here," she whispered at last, her voice breaking but certain. "I'm not going anywhere." Sophia exhaled with relief, her small arms tightening once more. Daniel's grip loosened only slightly, as though afraid to believe it. And Alexander gave a single nod, one corner of his mouth lifting into something that wasn't quite a smile, but close enough to promise it would come. Together, they walked back toward the house, the children holding fast to Isabella's hands, refusing to let go. The rain plastered their clothes to their skin, but no one cared. Each step, back to the porch, was a step into something new, a family not defined by perfection or blood, but by the choice to stay, to fight, to belong. When they reached the kitchen, Isabella's eyes fell on the 2 unopened letters still lying on the counter, their ink untouched by anyone but her. She didn't take them back. She didn't need to. Their presence would remain as a reminder of what could have been lost, and of what had just been saved. That night, as the children finally drifted to sleep with their hands still clutching hers, Isabella knew with unshakable certainty. She was no longer a guest in the Whitmore household. She was part of it, woven into its fabric, rain and all. The Whitmore household no longer moved in silence. Where once the walls had echoed with grief, Now the air brimmed with laughter, the clatter of dishes, and the rhythm of small, ordinary joys. Mornings often began with the smell of fresh bread or cookies, the children tugging eagerly at Isabella Hayes's hands to join her in the kitchen. Sophia insisted on measuring ingredients with meticulous care, while Daniel guarded the whisk as though it were a prized treasure. Even Alexander Whitmore, who had once moved through the house, like a ghost, had begun to linger in doorways, his expression softening each time he watched. His children's eyes light up around Isabella. It was during one such evening, as roast chicken cooled on the table and the scent of rosemary filled the air, that the unspoken barrier finally broke. Isabella set out the glasses of water, ready as always to retreat to the counter, while Alexander and the children ate. But this time, his voice stopped her. "Isabella," he said, his tone calm but deliberate. She looked up, surprised. Alexander gestured toward the empty chair beside Daniel. "Why don't you sit with us tonight?" For a moment, Isabella froze. She had grown used to being the caretaker, the one who served, not the one who belonged. But Sophia's face lit with excitement, and Daniel grinned as he patted the seat. "Sit with us," he urged. Heart tightening, Isabella crossed the room and took her place at the table. Dinner that night was simple, but unforgettable. Daniel animatedly described his latest sketch. Sophia teased him over smudges of charcoal on his fingers, and Isabella laughed with them, adding her own gentle comments. Alexander said little, but his gaze lingered often, watching, not with distance, but with recognition acknowledgement, that she was no longer an outsider. Weeks later, on a bright spring afternoon, Alexander appeared with an old camera in hand. "I thought we might take a picture," he said casually, though his eyes betrayed the weight of the moment. They gathered by the counter, flour dusted on Sophia's cheek, Daniel clutching a whisk like a trophy, Isabella's arm wrapped gently around them both. Alexander stepped in beside them, his shoulder brushing hers just as the shutter clicked. The photo, imperfect and slightly crooked, captured something far greater than posed smiles. Sophia looked at it thoughtfully and asked, "So, what are we now?" Alexander placed a steady hand on her shoulder, his eyes sweeping over all of them before answering with quiet certainty. "We're a family." Later, he framed the photograph and set it in the kitchen, crooked and unpolished but radiant, a testament to the choice they had made and the love that had bound them together. At last, the Whitmore story was never about perfection, it was about healing. What began in silence and sorrow slowly transformed into laughter, trust, and the warmth of belonging. Through Isabella's patience and quiet strength, Sophia and Daniel rediscovered the joy of childhood, and Alexander Whitmore, once imprisoned by grief, found the courage to open his heart again. Their home, once heavy with loss, became alive with simple rituals, cups of cocoa, garden mornings, shared meals, and the small but powerful declaration, "We're a family." This journey reminds us that love and healing are not born overnight. They grow in the soil of patience, nurtured by kindness, and protected by presence. Even when a family feels shattered, beyond repair, compassion and consistency can weave the pieces together. Blood alone does not define a home, choices do. To stay, to forgive, to show up every day even when it's difficult, those are the acts that build a true family. Sometimes, life leaves us broken, convinced that healing is beyond reach. But just as Isabella, Sophia, and Daniel discovered, a single act of love can spark change, and steady presence can restore what grief once stole. Your family, whether by blood or by choice, needs not perfection, but your heart. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what family means to you. Don't forget to like this video if it warmed your heart, and subscribe to our channel to join our growing community, where stories of love, healing, and second chances live on.